All right. Hello, everyone. Hope we're all doing well. So today we're going to be talking about the ethics of clinical research. And we're going to look at a utilitarian critique of the conclusion that the author comes to. So first, what's sort of the context? So this paper is actually from the 60s. And there's a kind of a lot of clinical research that's going on and much of it, according to Beecher, our author, is um, morally questionable or just unethical from the outset. So, according to Beecher, there are at least two necessary conditions for an ethical study. First is informed consent. We're going to talk about informed consent a little later in the course in much more detail, but essentially, informed consent is the practice of making the research subject aware of the possible risks, the procedures, or the lack of knowledge of the risks, and thereby obtain consent from the subject, right? So the subject has to have an understanding of the risks and then has to consent to those risks or the imposition of those risks. Um, and Yeah, so essentially, the subject has to consent and know exactly what it is that she's consenting to. And the second condition is the presence of an intelligent, informed, conscientious, compassionate, and responsible researcher, right? So I think the idea here is something like if you have a person like that that's conducting the study, it's more likely that the study is going to be in favor of the subject's interests, right? Um, and so um, according to Beecher, ethical studies have to meet at least both of these criteria. Okay, so in this paper, Beecher gives us like more than 20 examples of unethical or ethically questionable studies, right? So there are studies in which, in some cases, up to 10% of the subjects are given placebos and die or maintain permanent health effects as a result of being given the placebos. Um, so that's really, really bad, right? So people are dying as a result of participating in this study. So according to Beecher, had these people have known that there was going to be, say, a 10% chance of them dying as a result of being a part of the study, right? They would not have consented because just contributing to science is not a good enough reason to take on the risk of dying or having significant permanent health effects. So, so according to Beecher, is had this information been given clearly to the subjects, they wouldn't have consented. All right, and so here's his very general conclusion. He thinks that an experiment is ethical or not at its inception, right, at the very beginning of the study, and it doesn't become ethical post hoc or after the study's conducted. The ends don't justify the means. There is no distinction between means and ends. So basically, the idea here is that, okay, suppose that we have a study where we haven't fully informed all of our subjects of the risks, and say a bunch of them die as a result of the study. But suppose that the study is like super significant, such that the significance of the study and how many people are benefited justifies withholding the information at the time of the study, right? Um, Beecher rejects that sort of justification for a clinical study, right? He wants to say that no, ethical studies are ethical at the beginning, right? And unethical studies don't somehow become ethical as a result of the significance of the study, right? So studies are made ethical at the start, not at the finish, right? Okay, so let's entertain a utilitarian critique of Beecher's position here. So recall that according to the utilitarian, outcomes and whether or not they optimize the welfare of all sentient beings is what makes an action morally right. So it's all about outcomes. So if morality is simply a matter of better and worse outcomes, well, then Beecher's conclusion is false. The outcome of the study, if it benefits enough people, can justify an allegedly unethical study, say a study where subjects aren't given full disclosure about, say, the risks involved with the study, right? So if utilitarianism is true, right, if that's the correct moral theory, well, then it seems like sometimes we don't have to share all of the information with the subjects, right? So if you, as a student in this class, right, have watched the video and done the readings on utilitarianism and have been persuaded by utilitarianism, but suppose that you've also been persuaded by Beecher's conclusion on the other hand, right? Well, it seems like you hold two views in tension because Beecher's conclusion involves rejecting some elements of utilitarianism. And if you accept utilitarianism, it seems like you also have to reject Beecher's general conclusion, right? So there might be some tension for you. Okay, so how can we reconcile Beecher's conclusion and utilitarianism, right? Can a utilitarian accept Beecher's conclusion? I'm going to move my face now. So recall that the general conclusion is that an experiment is ethical at its inception, and the ends don't justify the means, right? So a utilitarian may have to reject that general conclusion. However, we can draw a distinction between different kinds of utilitarianism. So we can distinguish an act utilitarian from what we might call a rule utilitarian. Okay, so what is act utilitarianism? An act is morally right according to act utilitarianism if and only if it optimizes the expected welfare or happiness of all sentient beings, right? So for instance, if I am in a situation where, say, killing my rich uncle in order to give all of his wealth away and feed a bunch of starving people who would have died without that money, right? If I'm in that situation, then according to act utilitarianism, I have to kill my uncle and give his wealth away to save that many people, right? So every act is evaluated based on whether or not it optimizes the welfare for all. So this is act utilitarianism. According to rule utilitarianism, an act is morally right if and only if it conforms with the set of rules that give us generally the best outcomes when 90% of people internalize the rule set. And this comes from Brad Hooker's book. I think it's Ideal Code, Real World. I think that's the name of it. So the idea here is that, okay, generally speaking, it's bad to kill people, right? Killing people gives us bad outcomes like a bunch of the time, right? So rather than trying to figure out if killing someone is going to give us a good outcome or not, what's going to give us generally the best outcomes is a rule that says don't kill people, right? So according to rule utilitarianism, I can't kill my rich uncle even if it benefits, say, a bunch of other people, right? Because it breaks this rule that gives us, generally speaking, the best outcomes. So an act utilitarian and a rule utilitarian can sometimes say, well, something is morally right, and then something is morally wrong on the other hand, right? They can have disagreements, but generally speaking, they agree that outcomes are what matter, but how we achieve those outcomes is different according to the act utilitarian and according to the rule utilitarian. Okay, good. So with that general distinction, let's return to Beecher's general conclusion. A rule utilitarian might actually be able to accept Beecher's conclusion as a tenet of the optimal rule set, right? So the idea here is that generally speaking, we get the best outcomes when researchers gain informed consent and are conscientious of the subject's interests. So for instance, if one study has the potential to say justify some people dying when they don't fully know the risks, even if that's the case, we shouldn't do it because the rule says that we have to get informed consent regardless of the outcomes. Well, why? Well, because most of the time getting informed consent is going to give us the best outcomes, right? Because there might be, say, a number of studies that aren't significant enough to justify some people dying, right? In which case we have a worse outcome. So given that we have this worse outcome that will obtain, say, some or most of the time, we can substantiate a rule that says obtain informed consent, which is Beecher's general conclusion, right? So the major conclusion here is that even if one study would give us a better outcome, say if we don't give informed consent, accordance with Beecher's conclusion gives us better outcomes most of the time, according to the rule utilitarian, right? So if you're a utilitarian, but you're also sympathetic to this idea that consent matters all of the time, well, you might reconsider your view and think about your view through the lens of a rule utilitarian, which says that we always have to follow these rules, right? And maybe we can break them under some circumstances, but generally speaking, we can't break those rules. Okay, so we've looked at Beecher's critique of various clinical studies that were going on during his time. And then we've also entertained an objection and a potential response by making the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Thanks.